Hey there, this is Natalie, and as promised in my last video all about Norn Greyrat, in this video I'm going to talk about Aisha. I do already have videos about what happens to both sisters in general, and one about the infamous deleted Aisha chapter of Redundancy, so you can check those out too if you want more content about Rudy's Emoto-chans. But in these new videos, I want to go deeper into their personalities and how they affect the story and the people around them. So this will be a deep dive into Aisha. But before that, very quickly, just to let you know, I am still in a persistent and pervasive state of brokenness. So I am offering custom writing editing services and custom voice recordings, which you can hire me for through Ko-fi. Since I am so broke, I'm charging about 50% of the market rate for editing for stories, novels, academic papers, essays, pretty much anything you want me to fix for you. So head over to Ko-fi, the link is in my description, if you want to commission me for any of these services, or you just want to help support the channel and help this poor little cat girl make sure she doesn't become a stray cat girl. Yeah. But that's enough of that. Now it's time to talk about Aisha. Apologies if there's any strange background noise. The sprinklers have just gone off outside and I'm not quite sure how long they're going to be on for, but I need to have the windows open because it's quite warm right now. I'll try to edit it out in post, but we'll see. Aisha's story of course begins when Paul has an affair with Lilia. This happens when Paul is sexually frustrated while Zenith is pregnant with Norn. People in this setting seem to believe you can't have SIGs when pregnant, which I found strange while reading it because Rudy also seems to believe this, despite having lived in the modern world, where this is not a thing people usually think. I don't have kids myself, but as a woman I'm pretty aware of stuff to do with pregnancy, and while I know you aren't supposed to dye your hair or eat prawns, you can certainly still have the SIGs. In fact, for women who are due to deliver their babies and it's being a little bit late, it's even recommended as a way to potentially induce it, along with things like eating spicy food. I don't know if that's an old wives' tale or whatever. I've never had a baby, so don't take this as actual advice. But it does serve as evidence that SIGs during pregnancy is not seen as dangerous or taboo in modern times. I've never been sure whether Rudy's view on this is because maybe in Japan it is still taboo, or whether it's an indication of his lack of knowledge about women, reproduction and so on from his past life. But in any case, Zenith was pregnant, Paul was horny, and Lilia came onto him. They did have history. Paul had actually, not sure how to say this without getting demonetized, but deflowered Lilia non-consensually when they'd known each other when they were younger. There's quite a lot to this story and I feel like I'll save it for when I do a video about Lilia herself because I've already talked a lot and Aisha isn't even born yet. But as bad as her past interaction with Paul sounds, she was always attracted to him. And her time working for the notoriously deviant royals afterwards made her think of Paul as practically a gentleman in comparison. She has no love interest of her own and has become frustrated herself by being around Paul and Zenith, who are always at it like rabbits. So she puts the moves on Paul and he's down for it. Obviously, neither of them are doing a good thing here. I'm just explaining the background to it and why it's understandable that Lilia would feel some guilt about it, which would later affect Aisha. Because I think that a lot of people forget that it was Lilia who instigated the affair and think that Paul took advantage of her on this occasion because he had previously. So Lilia shouldn't feel guilty. This is Mushoku Tensei though. It would never be that black and white. Still, as we see, Rudeus, wanting to keep the family together, persuades Zenith to let Lilia stay. Or at least, that's what seems like it happens to them. In reality, Zenith would never have kicked pregnant Lilia out, to face an almost certain death for her and her baby during the journey back to her hometown. We know this because in other loops Orsted's scene, where Rudy doesn't exist, Paul Greyrat always has his 2 daughters. But regardless, Zenith agrees that Lilia can stay and become Paul's second wife, and they'll raise the babies together. This may seem like Paul getting off scot-free. In fact, it even seems that way to Rudy. But we learn that Zenith gave him the condition that he could only sleep with Lilia if Zenith herself was pregnant again. In Mushoku Tensei, this never happens, but we know from Orsted that there were no other children of Paul in other loops either. So, assuming Zenith made this a condition every time, Paul basically committed to providing for Lilia as a wife, but they never had sex again. This is all relevant to Aisha because it affects how Lilia sees herself, and how she sees the roles of herself and Aisha in the family. Plenty of families in the setting, especially those headed by nobility, which Paul is, despite having rejected the world of noble politics himself, do have polygamy, or concubines involved. It's not something that would inherently make Lilia feel lower status to be a second wife. Rudy has 3 wives, and their social status as his wives and the mothers of his children is equal. But Zenith, who was raised in the Millis Church, which only recognises monogamy, first said she would only be with Paul at all if he would commit to being faithful. So she was within her rights to make insistences in keeping Lilia and Aisha in the family. That would indeed give Lilia a different status and perception of her position than Roxy or Eris would have. Zenith is doing this out of kindness and forgiveness. She's accepting a situation she'd made Paul promise not to put her in, and giving a solution that is kind to Lilia and Aisha without effectively rewarding Paul for breaking his promise to her. But this does lead to Lilia having an inferiority complex about both herself and her daughter, and believing, in this loop, that they both owe their lives to Rudeus. This is something she impresses onto Aisha from pretty much the moment she's born. It seems like after Norn and Aisha are born, Lilia and Zenith get along very well, and the family is functioning just fine. But while Paul and Zenith don't see Aisha as lesser than Norn, Lilia still does. A combination of her guilt about instigating the affair, the situation agreed on actually giving her a different status to Zenith in relation to Paul, and her gratitude for being allowed to stay, make her feel like she and Aisha don't deserve to live, but by Rudy's intervention, they got to. Everything about this makes perfect sense from a character writing point of view, and it really shows how a fairly basic idea like 2 sisters don't get along and are unfairly compared to each other is never just that basic when Riffigen does it. The dynamics of Aisha with the rest of the characters are the product of other characters' realistic flaws, beliefs and mistakes, plus the unique things he gave Aisha in her own right. Seriously, I don't stan authors like him just because I really want him to follow me on X. It's just that good that the more you think about any character, the more you see how well crafted it is, and a lot of that was probably done intuitively, rather than with years worth of notes and corkboards and red string like a lot of people think authors work. Still, I digress. We know this was how Lilia felt, and she raised Aisha with these beliefs. This all became more intense when the mass teleportation incident separated the 2 of them from the rest of the family. Now, Aisha only had Lilia's input, and of course, Rudeus was the one to rescue them both again, only increasing the gratitude Lilia felt they should have for him. Aisha's development continues to go on in this direction when she and Lilia, after the rescue, reunite with Paul and Norn. This all happens off screen, but we learn later on that they've been living with Zenith's mother Claire, who is Millis nobility and strictly adheres to their religion. Claire isn't very nice in general, and you can find out more about her in my video about Zenith's life, but she basically sees Lilia as the mistress and Aisha as lowborn. Now, I already talked about how this dynamic affected Norn in my last video, so I won't go over it all again here, but essentially, while Aisha was unbelievably gifted in intelligence and many practical talents, this was never used as something for her to be praised for, or even accepted for. Lilia merely thought these talents would be useful in serving Rudeus, who Aisha owes her life to, and Claire just used her successes to berate Norn for not being better than the mistress's daughter. This explains a lot about the situation with Aisha at the current point in the anime, that is, at the time of writing this video. Aisha is thrilled to be living with Rudeus and doesn't think she needs school, since she's already extremely smart and has learned all the practical skills to be an amazing maid from her mother. Her purpose in life is to serve her brother, and she's already so capable, so to her, it's obvious that she should be at home doing things for him, and it's a much better use of her time than going to school. Now, I know it seems strange to some people that someone who is that talented at a young age would make that choice, even without the whole ingrained idea of needing to serve Rudy. But honestly, I find it kind of relatable. I always thought school was a bit of a waste of effort. You know, writing stuff only your teachers would ever read, doing projects that don't benefit anyone. I kind of thought if I really was as smart as the teachers said, surely I could just get a job and do stuff for real and make money instead, which is why I left school at 16 and got a job as a software developer. Yes, I left the industry about 10 years later because the market was screwed, and now I'm broke. So I'm not saying I'm the smartest person ever or anything, just that I can see why someone who's singled out as intelligent at a young age might very well want to do something actually productive as soon as they can, rather than always being automatically inclined towards academic things. I know quite a few people who did similar things, and it's not something you often see in fiction, at least not without it being portrayed as wasted potential or as something they had to do that wasn't their choice. So I kind of like that Rifujin had it as, no, the smart sister wants to put her talents to use straight away, and so she does, and Rudy lets her, and she excels at everything after that. Another thing that's interesting about Aisha is the nature of her intelligence. We already have geniuses in the cast like Cliff, but Aisha's genius is less about the magical, and much more about the practical and social. Aisha can do things like find ways to recreate recipes that Rudy and Nanahoshi can remember from Japan. She raises a tree ant, which is usually a dangerous monster, to become a tame pet and a security system for the house. Sure, she can do all the normal maid stuff Lilia can do, but she can also do things like help deliver babies. She really just understands practical, physical things, and people, animals, and monsters, just really naturally. But yes, having Aisha in a purely domestic role would probably feel like a waste of her talents, and not even the best way to fulfill her objective of helping Rudy, given Lilia also moves in and works as a maid after the events of Turning Point 3. So later in the story, Aisha is utilised in a completely different way, setting up a mercenary company in Rudeus's name. She runs this with Linia and later Pasena. Linia and Pasena are good at bringing in tough beast men to serve as the mercenaries, and Aisha is gifted with business strategy as well as with anything else practical, so the business becomes a huge success with branches all over the world, helping the Greyrat family not only gain money but also connections and influence worldwide. Aisha thrives in this role and uses her network in ways that help with lots of situations in the plot of Mushoku Tensei, some of which I've talked about in other videos, like the rescue of Zenith in the Millis arc, but which I won't go over here because they're not Aisha-centric storylines. And the big Aisha-centric storyline that happens later in her life, and which we knew we were going to get to in the end, is the infamous Redundancy Aisha story. Now, as I said at the start, I do have a full video about this chapter that goes into exactly what happens in it, what its canon status is, and what Rifujin has said about it since, so you can check that out for all of the background. But the important points for this video are that, firstly, the chapter is about Aisha eloping with Ars, who is the son of Rudeus and Eris, and then how the family deals with the situation when she becomes pregnant with their son Leroy. Secondly, the chapter was deleted because the author was told it went against the terms of service of the site he was publishing it on, rather than because of a backlash. But he also wasn't happy with some aspects of it and was struggling to make a version that he was happy with, which is why there isn't yet a rewritten canon version of the Aisha and Ars story. But thirdly, the Aisha and Ars relationship is still canon to his mind, which is why it is still referred to in later Redundancy web novel chapters like Nanahoshi's, which are still published. So what all of that means is, while it may change from the version in the deleted chapter, it is still his intention that Aisha and Ars get together, and that it is a mistake on Aisha's part, but that the family support them, and in the end they stick together and raise their son. So while the entire chapter cannot be considered canon, a lot of things about it do show us how he sees Aisha growing up, as the result of getting into an initially very misguided relationship with Ars, her young nephew. So we can take the aspects of it that show things about Aisha's character in the deleted chapter as how Rifujin sees her developing, even if the events themselves end up being a bit different in the ultimate canon. And the most telling things about Aisha do include the reason she starts the relationship in the first place, and the way she reacts to Rudeus finding her when she's pregnant and in hiding by thinking he'll literally want to kill her. So let's look at these one at a time. Aisha's story relates to Norn's here because, as I talked about in my last video, at the start of Redundancy, when both sisters are in their mid-20s, Norn marries her dream man, Redundancy, and has a baby. Now, Aisha, despite being just as pretty as Norn and as accomplished as she is, has no love interest. She was raised to think she should marry Rudy by Lilia, and he doesn't want that, because he's over the degeneracy of his past life, even when she first moves in, and he just isn't at all sexually interested in his little sister. So it's something that has become more of an inside joke between them as she's grown up, but it's still there in her mind. She's not supposed to be with someone else, so she just doesn't look for romantic attachments, despite her many connections and undeniable appealing qualities for a partner. When Norn marries a man who loves her and has a child with him, while Aisha is happy for her, despite the sisters never really having a truly close bond, she's also, for the first time, feeling like she's actually lost to Norn, who she usually always surpasses. It isn't as black and white as that. It's not like they were consciously competing over a man or even to be the first to get married, but Aisha feels like she's lacking something important that she may not have really recognised she was missing until she sees Norn have it. But she wants love, a real bond with someone special, not just to date an eligible guy she knows through her work, or a good partner from a political aspect. And without Rudy being interested, her bench isn't that deep. She's always been close to Ars, like literally since he was born, and she kind of convinces herself this means she's in love with him. The relationship ensues, and since that's the part that may be changed, and it's also already explained in my video about the chapter, I'm not going to go over it all here. So let's then go on to how Aisha expects to be treated by the family when they find her in Ars after they've eloped, hidden for a year, and she's now heavily pregnant. Ars is now 12, by the way. Yes, the chapter is very sketchy in terms of the stuff that the characters do, but I would like to remind everyone that there is nothing graphic or sexual in the chapter, and it's clearly intended to explore the drama the situation creates in the family and Aisha's character, rather than to be a titillating story for people with questionable interests. Still, Aisha's expectation is that Rudeus and his wives will want to kill her, and her first instinct is to say that that would be fair. She'll accept her death, but can they please spare Ars? Now, Rudy is shocked and horrified. The rest of the family doesn't hate Aisha or Ars or want to punish them. They just want them to realise that this situation was a mistake and find a solution that will end up good for everyone, including the baby. And that's what they ultimately do. But Aisha's reaction really hammers in the self-hatred and sense of inferiority she got from her mother's ideas about their status in the family. This is made even clearer when Rudeus brings Aisha and Ars home. Lilia threatens her with a knife and says she should never have been born, as well as apologising to Rudeus for her lowborn daughter seducing his precious son. I mean, yes, Aisha shouldn't have seduced him. That being a mistake is basically the premise of the story, but it's not because of a difference in status or worth, and the last person going off at Aisha for it should really be the mother who raised her to think she should bang her brother. But this really brings it all back to those early events that led up to Aisha's birth, and why I talked about that so much in this video. Lilia is not a bad person. Aisha is not a bad person, yet things that happened changed how they see certain things in life and made them act in ways that seem insane, as well as completely awful. It's all just very human. Still, to close off Aisha's life that we know of so far, the solution the family find, and this may change in detail in the final canon, is that after their son Leroy is born, Aisha is sent away to study in Azura until Ars comes of age, while the family raise the baby and teach Ars how to look after him. When Ars is about 16, and remember the age of majority in this setting is 15, his mother Eris passes on the technique Longsword of Light to him, Ars being a swordsman like her, and this is seen as him coming of age. So he goes to Azura, where Aisha is now working for Queen Ariel, and brings her back. They get a house close to the rest of the family and raise their son, while also working on things related to Rudeus and Orsted's overall goals. And while the specifics of this may change, that ultimate solution is probably going to be the canon, because as I said earlier, them being a couple and working on things for people like Perugius is mentioned in later chapters that were not deleted. So that's nearly everything I wanted to say about our girl Aisha, apart from this extra interesting bit of lore. So, if you've read all of Mushoku Tensei, or have seen the video about the mass teleportation incident, where I basically spoil the final chapter, then you'll know that in the loop prior to the loop Rudeus exists in, a whole series of events unfold that lead to Rudy, Nanahoshi, and Nanahoshi's boyfriend, the likely sequel main character Akihito, all being summoned. I'm not explaining all of that again because it's in another video and it's complicated as balls, but there is a woman involved in this story who is referred to as the Magic Knight, and she seems to know everything. Now, there's nothing in the chapter that tells us this character is one we know from a loop where Rudy exists, but she's clearly very important. And apparently, and this is secondhand information that I haven't been able to verify because it's just really hard to search for direct riffaging quotes when you can't search in Japanese, but Japanese-speaking sources within the Mushoku Tensei community tell me that he has confirmed that the Magic Knight in that loop is Aisha. Now, this final chapter takes place several years after Rudeus would die of old age in the next loop, so Aisha would be in her 80s. And while it's perfectly possible that a human of that age could be doing this kind of job and have all their faculties intact, it would at the very least be remarkable, and the Magic Knight is never described as an elderly woman. So my theory, if the Magic Knight is Aisha, is that in this loop, just as she does in Rudy's loop, she gets to know Perugius, and the time-freezing power of his familiar, which is used on Nanahoshi in Mushoku Tensei, was maybe used on Aisha in that loop. Why? Well, in that loop there was a prophet who said a hero from another world had to be summoned. In the final loop, the role of the prophet will probably be Lara, Rudeus's first daughter with Roxy, and the prophesized hero the Beast Tribe foresaw as the companion of their sacred beast, because she takes a big interest in divination, which isn't a subject that many people are interested in the Mushoku Tensei setting. But of course, Lara couldn't exist in the previous loop, so the prophet there could be anyone really. But if this prophet was trusted about summoning someone, it's very possible that Aisha, still a genius, wanted to make sure she'd be around to aid in all of this, and got Perugius to do that for her to make sure that she would. But still, that stuff is just theory and speculation about the past loop Aisha, and I just thought you might find it interesting to wrap up the video. The Aisha in Rudy's loop, the final loop, is a character we know well, but whose ending may still be in flux due to some meta stuff around the Redundancy chapter. But after all of that, what do you think of her? Let me know in the comments, and also let me know which sister you're most like, if you've watched my Norn and Aisha videos. I think I'm more an Aisha, but I love them both as characters. Thank you as always to my supporters on Patreon and to everybody who helps me out by donating to Ko-fi or commissioning me for work. It is really important to me at the moment and I can't tell you how grateful I am. Thank you also to everyone who subscribes to my channel and watches my videos. Thanks for watching this one, and I hope to see you again very soon.